This lesson is a recap of Chapter 1's major concepts and should be helpful for the AP exam. Geographers looked at 5 specific things related to Earth. Space is the first one. So these are patterns and regularities across Earth that can be depicted on maps. For place, that's a unique location of everything on Earth. We can identify a place in a number of different ways. Through absolute or relative location, we can also consider the history or religious affiliation of a particular place, and we can often see that the name that is given to a place has some relevance as well. A region is an area formed by distinctive combinations of features. You'll want to be familiar with different regions around the world. For example, when you're talking about South America, Europe, the Middle East, South Asia, those are all examples of regions. When using scale, we see that places are unique yet similar to others. So if we are comparing California in correlation to the entire United States, or if we're looking at the United States in comparison to other countries around the world, scale is often used as a way to do so. And lastly, we have connection. This deals with relationships of places and regions. We can often see that there are cultural connections of people that correlate to the places and regions that exist in the world. When looking at location, you'll want to know the difference between absolute and relative location. Remember, absolute is typically associated with lines of latitude and longitude, so degree points around Earth, and it could also include exact addresses. Relative location, on the other hand, is typically associated with where a place is in relation to other places. So if you were going to ask where the closest shopping center would be, I might give you directions that can help you identify the different areas at which you would navigate that. So I might give you different streets and different stop signs and different distances on the road in which you might take to get there, using directions like left and right, northwest, east, and south, things like that. Remember, regions are also important for you to know. So the different regions that exist in the world can include North America. Rather than South America, we refer to it as Latin America. This would include Central America, the Caribbean islands, and also Latin America, as well as Mexico, which is typically considered part of North America. We can see Europe. We can even refer to Western Europe and Eastern Europe, which would include Russia. You might see Central Asia, South Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia. We can see the Middle East, North Africa, West Africa. Sometimes we refer to these regions as just North Africa, and then Sub-Saharan Africa, which would be south of the Sahara. So just some examples. You'll want to revisit the different ways that regions can be identified. When talking about regions, we can also categorize them. So we can look at formal, functional, and perceptual. What are the differences? Well, formal regions are often associated with political geography. So we can see distinctive regions that make up the different states in the US. We can see that's often associated with a formal government structure in which there is sovereignty and authority given to that region. Next, we have a functional region, and typically there is a node that dictates what that function may be. And then the further out you go from the node and the further out you are, the less influential or impactful that functionality will be. So some examples of this would include Silicon Valley, Wall Street. Then we can look at the perceptual regions. Perceptual regions actually include multiple characteristics that give that region the perception of a particular culture, that everyone that resides within that region shares certain types of characteristics. So again, the key here is that there are multiple things that play into this. The southeastern region of the United States is considered a perceptual region for for religious reasons. So many people identify as being Southern Baptists that live in this region. The weather and climate plays into it as well. Perhaps the political party that happens to be the biggest identifier for individuals that happen to live in the region. These are all things that might contribute to it being perceived as a distinctive region. Also keep in mind that functional might be referred to as a nodal region and perceptual may be referred to as a vernacular region. Next, we have the concept of diffusion, and there are different types of diffusion. The first is relocation diffusion. This is often associated with colonization and the history of colonization in the world. So, people actually physically moving from one place to another. It's also often associated with the transatlantic slave trade. The other type of diffusion includes expansion diffusion, and there are subcategories of expansion diffusion as well: hierarchical, contagious, and stimulus. Hierarchical has to do with a distinctive leader or power entity that has dictated the diffusion of an idea, a concept, a type of government, a religion, whatever it might be. You can trace it back to someone of significance. And so, again, this can be a leader. It could also be a famous person, but either way, it's coming down from someone of significance. Contagious, on the other hand, has to do with something that can spread rapidly, and at the same time, there might not necessarily be a distinctive way to trace back where that may come from. And so, we can also see that this may be associated with diseases, but at the same time, it could also mean like a viral video. Again, not coming from a famous person, but rather just kind of catching trend and a lot of other people that may also be carrying forth that trend without it being too distinctive and spread by anyone of any particular significance. And then lastly, we have stimulus diffusion. That typically has to do with an idea that may also influence the innovation and other ideas as well. And so the text talks about technology and how one technological innovation may not be the same exact idea as it moves forward into other innovative ideas, but it could, at the core, could still be what impacts or builds on those ideas that come later. An example of this might be, the innovation of the first cellular phone and how some of those ideas may have stimulated the expansion of other ideas that we now see in smartphones. Next, we have maps. So you want to know different types, how maps can be distorted, and how projections can look different. So let's first talk about distortion. Maps are two-dimensional, but the Earth itself is not two-dimensional. It's three-dimensional. So with that being said, you've got distortion that can impact the shape of land masses, where land may appear more elongated or squished than it is in reality. Distance can be distorted, so that's the distance between 2 points becoming increased or decreased. Relative size is also distorted. Land areas may appear bigger or smaller. And then direction from one place to another can be distorted. So let's look at a few different types of maps and the kind of distortion that may exist on each of them. The first is the Mercator projection. So if you come down here, you can see some pros include shape and direction, but some cons are size is distorted closer to the poles. So this is where we see that Greenland looks much bigger in comparison to Africa. And then when we're looking at the Robinson projection, we can see that pros include allocating space to oceans, but cons would include land masses being smaller. And then looking at the Peters projection, or the Gal-Peters projection, we see equal size and proportion as a pro, but the major shape the shape distortion we can see here as well. So the shape is very distorted. And then lastly, for the Goody-Homolocene projection, some pros would include shape and size, but the cons are that it distorts the meridians and the parallels, as you can see here. Next, we can look to distribution. And with distribution, you have subcategories, including density, concentration, and pattern. So geographers identify three main properties of distribution across Earth. Density is the frequency with which something occurs in space. It involves the number of a feature and the land area. Concentration is the extent of a feature spread over space. It means closely spaced together or clustered. And also, they could be relatively far apart, which would be known as dispersed. And then for pattern, that includes the geometric arrangement of objects in space. This is best reflected in township and range, which we see in the United States. With the Land Ordinance of 1785, we can see the different grids, we can see the organization, and we can see that land is arranged in very geometric patterns. Now, a major difference between density and concentration would be, let's say we're looking at a map and colors are associated with the size of the population. Well, you might find that California specifically might have a red color that just distinguishes California as having a high population. But if you looked at the concentration, you would find that there should be a much darker color around the Los Angeles region in comparison to, let's say, the Central Valley. Let's take a look at scale. We can look at a place's scale on a map, right? If you look at Google, you can actually go to a larger scale or a smaller scale, depending on what it is that you want to see. And you're often scaling down below with a kind of plus sign or a minus sign to, scale further in or further out. So with that being said, we can actually see scale reflected in a ratio or fraction form. This will show that the ratio of a distance on a map compared to real Earth's measurement would be reflected there. So for example, if we're looking at 1 inch on a map in comparison to 1 mile in in real time or in real in real Earth measurement. And then looking at a bar graph, that can show the ratio of the distance on the map to the distance on Earth. And then we can also see it in a formal written form, which just describes the relation between the map and Earth in words. And so when we're talking about the small scale versus large scale, a small scale is going to show a large area without a lot of details. It's going to be further out. It might be an entire map of California with all of its different, highways and roads on it. If we're looking at a large scale, this is going to show a smaller area with a lot of detail. So as you start to, make that space a lot larger to see the details, you might see, rather than looking at highways and roads, you might actually be able to see like different buildings or shopping centers, maybe even cars themselves in that map. The last topic we're going to talk about is mapping. So we can look at physical maps and political geography maps. There are so many different types of maps, but these are the big ones. So when you're talking about political geography, this is something that we as humans have created and constructed. We've created these borders. We have an understanding of the different types of governments that have sovereignty or power over different parts of the world, and so we've created those lines and boundaries that we can see on maps. That would be considered a political geography map. When we talk about physical geography maps, those boundaries are not included. Instead, you see physical features. You see mountains, you see rivers, you see larger bodies of water. You might take into account elevation. And so, physical geography maps and political geography maps are different in that way. Mother Nature versus human construct. Keep in mind that this only covers just a few concepts. They are big concepts, but it would be wise to go back and study the chapters in review books and then also take the quizzes if you haven't already.